we're back for another enthralling conversation about our mental health system. Renee, what are we talking about today?
Hey, today we're going to be talking about kids and the children's system and what that could look like and how it's the same and how it's different than adult systems and kind of going into some weeds on this. But how is your, farming going? I know you're going to be planting here real soon, if not currently. What's going on in farmland?
Well, I need a new seed tube for, I load my planter and the rivets fell out and the tube started to tear. So I got to drive 2.5 hours to a specialty place to get a 2-foot seed tube. It's $21 a foot for a 6-inch tube. So $40. It was going to cost me 100 to ship it. So I'm going to drive up to Northwest Iowa because
True
I'm all
farmer.
about saving money, right? So
True,
when
the
we
true
talk
farmer
about
right there.
I should give up and let go or what, no, I'm going to save the money and it's going to cost me more by the time I stop for food and fill the truck up with but that's what I do, right? That's a farmer. So I get to be road tripping here really soon to get parts.
All right. I could ask what a seed tube is, but then we'd probably be off track and I'd be lost for a very long time. So I probably won't. We'll save that another day when I bring my nephew out to the farm. You'll explain to us what a seed tube is. But
Yep.
he probably already knows, but I don't. He's 9. He'll absolutely know, and I will not. Well, today we're going to talk about the children's mental health system, and this one's near and dear to my heart. For those of the listeners that don't know, I ran for office way back in the way back days. The idea was to fix the children's mental health system because I was coming out of time working not only as a therapist in families with a provider in the community, but then took a time of with having foster kids in my home and was doing the therapeutic foster care. And let me just say, none of it worked for so many reasons, but a lot of bad things happened through that season and things just couldn't work. We couldn't get simple things. At least I thought they were simple. We couldn't get like their school records to transfer so we could get them in school correctly. We couldn't get support when they were maybe blowing out of our house and we needed, either some respite or a place to go or, even some time out to kind of figure out what to do different because it just wasn't working. It just was a terrible scenario. And so I ran for political office and that was the whole entire goal. But when I got there, Jason, I was so disheartened because I was told couldn't fix the children's mental health system because I had to fix the adult one first. So unfair. And you do know they're not the same. So, Jason, today when we're talking about a children's system, what is a children's mental health system?
Well, what should it be or what
Yeah,
is it?
yeah.
Because, I think we could be honest that we still don't have a true children's system, even after all of these years, if we really want to be honest with ourselves. Would you agree?
I agree.
And so that's kind of the difficulty. And when it's funny you say we have to fix the adult system first. Well, the adult system really should be disconnected from the children's system because, kids aren't just short adults. Kids
What?
have a unique, specific need, right? And so the way
Yeah,
we approach them, the way we treat them, the system that they're part of, when we think about the education system that they overlap with, when we think
right.
about even in healthcare, we have pediatricians. We separate everything out for kids. It's very, very different. Even the functions of DHS and protective services is very different with children than adults. And so the fact that we still can't figure out that we need a separate, distinct system for kids is concerning. And we're not the only state to struggle with this.
No,
But boy, it seems like it's been a real struggle in
it
Iowa
has.
over the last, you go back to 2005, having some of the same conversations we're having today certainly does, wow, kind of, it's a little depressing. I'll be honest, not to bring it down, but where do we start when we think about a children's system, right? Like we talk about systems all the time, right?
Mm-hmm,
Which is a continuum of care that meets people's needs where they are,
mm-hmm,
right? And so I think the biggest disconnect, if I can take a soapbox for a minute,
mm-hmm,
and stand on it, would be why aren't our systems integrated within schools? All kids go to school, or most kids, right, go to school,
mm-hmm,
yet our behavioral health systems are completely disconnected most of the time from our education system. And
mm-hmm.
so the number one thing I would ask ourselves is why are these systems fighting for as long as I can remember, as opposed to partnering and working together to provide care together? I watch a lot of other states, and there's been a lot of movement. There's healthcare centers. There's even dental provided in many school districts. If we go to other
Mm-hmm.
states, physical health, behavioral health, medications. I mean, there's a whole movement of school-based healthcare.
Yep.
right? And so we have clinics embedded in schools all over the country. We can hardly even communicate between a healthcare provider and a school in the state of Iowa today. And so I find that really discouraging.
Yeah. Well, to turn it around for something that is encouraging about children and the children's system, the years of being a child is when your brain is developing faster than it ever will. And you've got the most potential for change and improvement and growth, and the real opportunities for your brain to start thinking differently. And we all know that people's brains aren't fully developed until they become adults. And for boys, that's around age 26, whether they think so or not. And for girls, it's closer to age 23. So the time up until 23 and 26 really is a great opportunity to help mold and shape sort of how we're thinking. And so the other side of being a child is a lot of the trauma that's occurred that's causing some of the underlying issues that may be bringing up psychological issues and substance issues. They're closer to it. So, they might have happened when they were younger, but they're closer to it. And if you deal with those traumas and those things early as children, you can build resilience a lot quicker than having maybe say suppressed it for 20, 30 years. And then as an adult, all of a sudden starting talking about what happened to you as a child. And so there's really, really good value for why we want to work with kids, because they're pretty pliable, generally speaking. They are able to make change pretty quick. They learn really fast. And so if you can intervene in a child's life early, whether it's on a prevention scale before something happens, or if we think about the I'm going to use the acronym ACE, and I always get it wrong, but everybody knows what an ACE is. Thinking about
Adverse
ACEs.
childhood experiences.
Thank you for the acronym update. And yeah, but things happen as kids, right? But if you deal with that when they're close to it, they're more pliable and able to build from it and move forward. And so it really, really is important to think about kids. And this is why I wanted to work on this system 20 years ago. And the fact that it's still not put together, it is hard, but we've made some progress in this. But I know one of the pieces of a system that, that we get stuck and people think is system is shelter. And that's not exactly what I'm thinking about when it comes to treatment. So Jason, what is a shelter and how do we use those? I think they're still in existence today.
They are. And so it's just a dated term, right? And so, there is a need at times for kids for protection. If we go back in time, kids shelters were designed for kids who were abused and neglected to have a safe place to go in an emergent situation. Unfortunately, what's happened in our state, especially, is over time, it's evolved to the point of kids who have an acute mental health condition who can't be accepted to the hospital but can't go home are taken to shelters. And so it's a very different population than those kids who are abused and neglected, right, or have trauma and need a safe place to be for a couple of days until other family members can be located, or a foster home or someplace else can be identified. And so when we start thinking about what responses we have within our toolbox, unfortunately, shelters have evolved into something completely different. In adults, we have what we call, the crisis residential, or those types of mental health designed short-term placement facilities. Well, that's never happened with kids. And so we have all these different populations mixed, which actually causes trauma for everyone involved in those situations.
Yeah. So if we were to look at the big picture, kind of, we've done, this is toward the end of our big picture of what a system should look like at a high level. And we talk about everything from crisis, what that should look like. And then you move into maybe acute and residential and, kind of a long-term, like a state hospital level. PMIC is what we call it for the Children's Psychiatric and Mental Institute for Children. Thinking about that continuum, what pieces do we see? Because you were talking about schools earlier, and there really should be, to your point, of some school counseling available, even, family involvement. I mean, I was an in-home family therapist decades ago now. And so this has been around a long time. And helping kids, you could make a kid, and sometimes parents want you to fix their kid. And I'm going to say this real clearly, that doesn't work because the kid's going back into the system that is dysfunctional. So you've got to not only work with the child, but you've got to work with adults. And this is what starts making a children's system kind of bogged down, because it's not just, hey, fix the kid, because then you've got, to your point, you've got child welfare involvement. If there's been human services reports or abuse allegations, you've got, juvenile justice gets involved if there's behavioral challenges or illegal activity. And so there's all of these state departments that have to function together in tandem to build them an education system, what you said earlier.
Mhm.
So 4 major state departments, without me thinking too hard, that have to work together on a children's system. So it's not just like adult mental health when you can kind of pull it aside and put it together, which is huge anyway, undertaking, pulling it together with substance use, which is a big undertaking for adults. But when you get into kids, these really big institutions now, state institutions, have to work together to take care of a child. And we just don't have that done yet.
Well, and we're missing one huge thing that we could help to decrease the need for all of the other things you just said, and that's prevention, early intervention, and screening. Because with kids, most mental health conditions are going to start showing themselves before age 14, right?
Mhm.
Many of them show at a much younger age when we're not even screening yet. So we could be preventing a number of these things from being worse, right? By intervening earlier, putting strategies in place, putting supports in place, providing what's necessary so that we don't need all those intensive services later in life. Unfortunately, that's not always funded, right? Or, that becomes a funding barrier. But, if we need to think about being proactive, how do we get farther upstream in helping to support kids? And, let's be honest, if we're helping people be successful in school, right? A kid who's more likely to get through 3rd grade is more likely to get to 8th grade. A kid who's more likely to get through, we know the statistics around what happens as kids' behaviors increase due to a mental illness or substance use disorder during that 14 to 16, age group. We can do so much to intervene earlier. So, I think about how do we get farther upstream? Because that takes a lot of pressure off the rest of the system to not need all that intensive stuff that causes kids being removed, the trauma of going out of home placements and all of those things that happen.
Right. And this is going to sound maybe crazy and out of the box, but I'm going to say it anyway. Some kids, some of this stuff is personality driven and based. You can see an anxious little person very young and they grow into an anxious type personality. And if you work into like a personality type inventory as an adult, they're going to kind of land in the category of the more anxious side of life that was the same from when they were small. So you can be predictive on the fact that that's their personality and that's how they came out of, that's how they were born, that this is the way it's going to be. And so those, to your point, you can predict that pretty early on. You can also see that melancholy, kind of more isolative, depressed type of person. They can transform and bloom and blossom and not be that. But if they start out that way pretty small, if there's not any kind of intervening, they're going to still grow up to be more like that. Just like if you're seeing somebody that's brilliant, that we used to be in that Asperger's autism space, and then they just don't socialize well. There's tons of research now that shows if you get them into treatment early and you can help them, learn how to better socialize so that they're not as extreme, maybe being brilliant but having no social skills. There's actually treatment that works, but that only works if you catch it before age like 6 or 7. We're talking They have to be 3s, 4s, and 5s to try to get that type of treatment that helps. And so to your point, it needs to be talked about a lot earlier. And I think part of the concern is that parents think that, well, we're going to diagnose them at something really small. That's not what it's about. It's about finding the tendencies that one of them has so that you're looking at predictive factors of where they could go in the future. For example, I work in prison. That's what we do now. And those folks that have an antisocial personality disorder, before that had a oppositional defiant disorder or a conduct disorder by definition in the DSM. So you had to have those, which started at age like 9 or 10. The conduct disorder is before age 18. You've had both of those before you hit antisocial. It is a pattern that starts really early. So they're disregarding pro-social authority really young. And they even have what is that diagnosis? It's intermittent explosive disorder in some cases where they're just violent outbursts and stuff. That stuff, if you've met one of it as a child, sticks right here because it's a picture that you cannot forget. And it is a pattern of life. They could have been built that way, genetically born that way, or something happened traumatic really young to start that path. But it is a trajectory. So by the time I see them in prison, you've seen all of that. There's a whole arc of what's happened. You don't just land in prison, never, with an antisocial personality disorder. There has been a lifelong set of travesty behind them. And so, those are the things we're talking about. And I think parents miss the boat when they don't want people screened because they think, well, we're just going to diagnose our kids. actually what we're trying to do is see kind of where their bent is, to see where you can mold them and shape them away from, because everybody's personality has a dark side. We all do. And that's, as adults, we all do. And we could be in a healthy state and be in a good spot with our personality, or not healthy. And so it's a matter of knowing that and being able to get that, like you say, those interventions sooner. Sorry, I got on my soapbox today, but that's a big one for me, because we just missed the boat where parents don't want to talk about it.
And I think the key is when we do those screenings, having access to appropriate treatment. And so that's the other issue when we talk about kids services, is treatments tailored for kids and families. Because again, if our system is slanted toward adults, then so is our treatment modalities. And what we're going to do, and we're not looking at the best evidence-based practices and clinicians who are trained in dealing with really young kids, because it's different. It looks different in a developing youth, of how we're going to intervene, of how we're going to educate parents, of how we're going to engage that entire family system. All of that looks very different when you're dealing with kids. And so part of it is I'm all for screening, but I've been on my soapbox about screening before. If you can't do something with the screening that's going to be impactful, then we shouldn't be screening at all, right? Because it does more damage, right? And so I see that happen at schools today, that they screen, but then there's no clinicians to refer to, because we do have some legitimate workforce issues and not enough specialty providers for kids when those screenings come up that a kid is really depressed. And what do we need to do to engage that system? And so, I put that out there just as part of it. Again, without the entire continuum, you just can't piecemeal this together. You really have to be thoughtful of how do we provide screening and then meaningful intervention based upon what we learn from the screening that can then help support that child with what the screening information was, and just help move them forward.
Yeah, I had two thoughts. So everybody in school, you get an eye exam, eye screening, and you get hearing screening. Could you imagine if we just don't deal with either of those? You screen them and then do nothing. We don't do that, right? We automatically make sure that kids get whatever if they have a hearing, and that's young, and making sure that they can see. I have a friend of mine whose daughter just had to get glasses, and she was very, very scared about having to wear them. She's a tiny one. She's probably kindergarten, maybe first grade. She's so cute. But mom and her got the kind that are the pair eyewear, so they can make a match, because that way she didn't feel so alone wearing them, because the mom's matched hers. And so brilliant to try to work with your child to make that more comfortable. I remember my brother had to have the special goggles to be able to play sports, because he broke every pair of glasses he ever had. But the little dude couldn't see. But yet in mental health, we don't want to screen it. We don't want to know. We don't want to help. And it just doesn't make sense. One of those thoughts that I have is just like, how did we get here where we don't want to know what's going on with our kids? And I remember, I can talk about this forever, because I worked in children's units for a long, long time, just like you did, Jason. And I remember being at babysitting in a church in like daycare, and there's a little guy we could tell was autistic. Everybody but the parents could tell. And, they just didn't want to know, didn't want to discuss. He was very high need, high intervention in just Sunday daycare. And, we were trying to, how do you talk to parents who just don't want to hear this, and going, hey, but if you got him help today, he could make changes. And it's just really tough, because it's just hard to understand with parents. So I know we've got some data in this, and there's a group that we follow called CAMI for Kids. That's a long acronym all by itself, but it's about mental health for kids. And there's a group of stakeholders that include people like Blank Children's Hospital and Unity Point Health and other institutions and groups, United Way. And there's a lot of data that they share about kids in this space. So Jason, talk to us about what are we seeing with some of the information?
Yeah, well, to set the stage, I do think there is some movement on talking about it more. And I think that's happened a lot since the pandemic. I was reminded the other day that it's been 4 years since we went through that. Renee, we did a lot of work throughout the pandemic, working with folks and really digging into some of that data around the increases in anxiety and depression that still continue today. Unfathomably, we're still dealing with 2 to 3 times the rate of anxiety and depression, and that was disproportionately felt by kids. So we look at the under 18 population, the disruption that occurred, through college age kids throughout the pandemic, socialization issues that schools are still recovering from, colleges, universities are still struggling to engage kids to some level. I think it's important that we couch the data we're going to talk about right now in everything changed in the last 4 years. And it has not been good for this age group's emotional well-being whatsoever. And so with that said, some of this data, from 2000, here's a 2021 statistic that 36% of Iowa's 11th graders felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more. And to the point they stopped doing usual activities compared to only 25% in 2016. So,
Wow.
that you're looking at 11% increase there. 24% of Iowa 11th graders reported considering suicide in 2021. That's one quarter, right? 1 out of 4.
Wow.
And so those are significant points of data. We look at visits to emergency departments from 2016 to 19. That's pre-pandemic for 6 to 12-year-olds doubled. I'm going to just go out on a limb and say, I bet they've doubled again, because we hear anecdotally all the time of EDs struggling with this population. And we just have to deal with the reality that suicide is the second leading cause of death among Iowans aged 15 to 24 years old,
Wow.
right? So this is a public health crisis. When we talk about suicide, and we talked a little about age, but 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by age 14. And so we see those risk factors, we see the signs, all of those things we can pick up on really young, right? You talk about 6, 7, 8 years old. We're seeing some of that. Doesn't mean somebody can be diagnosed then, right? Per official, but if we're seeing it, we can start to intervene with strategies. And some of those statistics came from NAMI. We're going to link to that Cami for Kids website and fact sheet, because I think it's a great little one-pager to help get a sense for what it is we're really talking about today.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a lot of really disturbing data. And we've been talking about the fact we're going to go here in the future after we conclude our series here on what the system should look like. I think there's only a couple more in this series. But once we get past this, we're going to talk about some of the things that we chat about all the time when we go out to conferences. Because for us coming up here in the next month, we start conference season. We're going to be out on the road all over the Midwest and rural communities, invited to conferences, and we'll be sharing more about that as we hit the road, but sharing some of that information. And one of those things that we are going to be talking about, to Jason's point, is what changed during the pandemic. And even people that were really pro shutdown and pro removing kids from school because of COVID, you see them all the time now, 4 years in, going, we will never do this again because of the damage and the disaster of what happened after the fact. And so even the people that were the most pro trying to, do the right thing, science did not bear out any of that. And so that isolation for kids through that time period and keeping them away from others and away from school really did not do anybody a service. And so we're seeing that in this data. We're seeing that just in the middle of a number of kids in crisis. And so, this has been sort of a depressing conversation. So thinking about this from, if you're a family member or an advocate or somebody who wants to do more for children, what is happening now? What can we do now to try to get folks some better help?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think that there's probably not a more important issue to advocate around, right? And to engage your political officials and to have conversations about, because it is a depressing conversation, but it's because we do need to elevate this as being something we need our public officials to do something about. Because to some extent, within the system, we're kind of powerless, right? Until the system changes and until we can see some real actions taken. And I'll just give you a few examples of, in many states, they shut down shelters because they were trying to do the right thing of like, we're going to keep kids in foster homes. We're going to have families step up. We're going to use neighbors. Well, what happened was the unintentional consequence of that was when then kids needed something and there were no foster homes, we were actually at a place where kids were sleeping in the file room of the DHS office because they had no place to go. We actually heard stories of DHS workers taking kids to their own homes because there was no place to go, putting kids in hotel rooms alone because there was no place to go. And of course, there were no policies around this. They're just like, we can't just put these kids outside and leave them. And it was heartbreaking. We've just created a lot of unintentional consequences. And so we really need our lawmakers to engage around this issue and make meaningful change. And so sometimes we need to help them to get focused because they're spending a lot of time on other stuff. And so we need to help them understand what's the most important thing. We talked about kids aren't short adults, right? So there's no fixing an adult system. We need a kid system. There's not a lot of states doing it really well, right? There's a few, but in general, it's really hard to figure it out. And so, Renee, what would you suggest?
Well, I'm going to just double down on what you said, because I started talking at the beginning of the podcast about how children's brains are the most pliable and able to change when they're young. And so if we're sitting back and waiting to try to fix, quote, fix or correct or change adults, their minds are much more steadfast in where they are and more embedded in their problems and their issues by the time you catch them as an adult. So this really is, when we talk about that analogy of going upstream, this is like, if we're going to fix the mental health system, upstream is where it's at. We got to keep kids from falling into the water in the first place, because it's just not working out on the back end. And it's getting very, very expensive at the top end of trying to just take care of adults. Not that that's not important, not that that's not necessary, but had we maybe prevented a larger percentage of them of ever becoming adults with chronic needs, think of the cost savings there. And so it really, really is important to talk at the top. And it's going to take state intervention, because again, we're talking about the education system, we're talking about the human services system, we're talking about juvenile justice, which is a whole justice piece. And then you're talking about kids as a human services with HHS, and they're just not even under the same roof. So it's going to require state agency action and leadership at the top of the state to pull the partners together to say, hey, we got to make this work, because it can't just be done piecemeal. And unfortunately, education has made a run at it and has done some things. There's some changes, whether we like it or not, happening in the AEAs, which are the area education agencies in Iowa. There's some changes coming out through this legislative session, and by the time this is recorded, you may know exactly where it all landed. But the shakeup, the intention is probably good, but how it comes out remains to be seen. And there's, of course, concerns on what's happening. But they were built to help with some of this, and has not helped bring it all together. And so if they're wanting to stay as they are, but yet mental health is at all-time high, they definitely are not helping. And then the scores for folks with disabilities and such, not better. And so that system wasn't exactly working as it was. So yes, changes were necessary. But then you start thinking about, well, the state, we think about, okay, what to look forward to. Well, the state has put groups together now. So HHS, juvenile justice, is together now in HHS. Public health is now together in HHS. We're starting to get substance use and mental health together. And so there are some big system changes that are making a possibility here that this is going to be able to lay the groundwork. But all that to be said, we still have to have advocates that step up. That's why CAMI for Kids is an amazing organization, because it's so many groups getting together to just focus on what's best for kids. And so that's an organization you could probably get involved with. When in the show notes, again, we put it there, but know what they're up to, get involved, because there's lots and lots of nonprofits and groups that are, banding together to keep kids on the forefront. And that's such an amazing conversation. So really excited about that.
And as you talk with folks, don't be reactive, right? We want to get more prevention services up front. And so remember that we shouldn't always be looking at, those high level needs, but let's think about how can we do better to protect kids early on, protect kids from adverse childhood experiences, protect kids from experiencing trauma early on that is going to then lead them to a higher risk for mental health conditions and substance use disorders. Renee, what do you have for our recovering politician self-care policy of the week this week?
Well, last time we talked about a not to do list. It really is one of my favorite lists. But why I really like it is because it creates space on my calendar, space in my brain to think of, well, what could I do now? And I'm, if anybody knows me, for those that might follow the Enneagram, I'm a 7. I'm all about having fun and about a good time. And if it's not fun, I ain't doing it. And so it opens up opportunities for fun if I've done it correctly. If I get rid of some of the stuff that shouldn't really be on my calendar anyway, that's really kind of bringing me down, I have some opportunities for something cool. So I started thinking, as the weather gets warmer, you know what I really miss, Jason? I really miss golf. I used to be a good golfer back in junior high and high school. And it takes a lot of time. And so I just haven't put time into it like I want to. My husband's really kind of not into golf, so that didn't help me want to continue, but I think I want to pick it up again. I'm kind of excited. I don't know. Do you have anything that if you had more time on your calendar after planting season that you'd like to kind of get back into that you'd want to do?
Golf is high on my list, right? So golf and cycling are two things that I want to get back to, but golf speaks to me. I didn't golf at all last year, and I said to my wife many times, I'm like, I just need to get out. But between farming and stuff, I feel guilty taking 2 hours to go do a round of golf sometimes. But I will share with you one thing. I do have a 1969 three-wheel Harley Davidson golf cart, and it's got that fringe top, the vinyl fringe top
Very
on
classic.
top of it. I need a little engine work done to that. But there's nothing like a round of golf when you show up at the course with that thing. Let me tell you
Absolutely.
something. It people turn heads. I'm telling you.
Yes.
So when I golf, it's a whole golfing experience. Which, if you know me, you pretty much know that you would expect that. I would
It's all
suppose.
about
But
the experience and the story, I can guarantee. So I'm imagining,
absolutely.
regardless of what you're doing, that's the fun. There's an awesome show. I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's following golf seasons, and we're into season 2 right now. And yeah, I just am watching it again, going, man, I just really miss that. So maybe that'll be something we could think about. We could do a work outing. What would that
There we
help?
go.
We call it work, and so then we
I
we both
think
can get out and golf. We
sounds
call it
like a
work,
meeting. It sounds like a meeting to me. So
and maybe that'll help you then take the time off that you need. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Today we talked about a children's mental health system, and I know it's not exactly where we want it to be. And even, I mean, it's been 20 years for me on this journey, and I'm still not thoroughly impressed where we are. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And one of the pieces that I just want you to take away is that your voice really matters in this conversation. We know some major advocates in our state that are just making really big changes happen, and their voice is consistent and appropriate and just positive. And I'm hoping we can introduce you to one here on our podcast soon who just beats that drum consistently, steadily. And we're talking about prevention because they've got an adult child that they're dealing with today, and so wanting to have help now, but also realize that had we changed this before, wouldn't have to be here. And I know that's a big part of this conversation. So continue to be out there, continue to fight for prevention. And next time we get together, we're going to be chatting about jails and how they play a role in behavioral health system. Sounds crazy, I know, but we'll see you then.